Okay, yeah, so welcome to the rebuttal lecture where we'll be going over some of the components of rebuttals and then also mainly like types of strategies you can go for. Once again, like most of my lectures are geared towards more intermediate level debate, but also I hope like everyone can find something to take away and it's definitely like a lot of good reminders or at least refreshers to some of the core components and things that you should consider when you're giving rebuttals. So first, starting with just like a quick recap of the basic structure and like purpose of rebuttal. Obviously, it's a 4 minute speech, and then it's the first sort of dedicated speech to answering new content in the round. So you'll have constructives where you're just reading pre-written content for the most part, whereas in the rebuttal, you're getting the opportunity to now interact with your opponent's case and kind of creating new layers of analysis that aren't really predetermined based on like when you're prepping or when you're not really in the round. It's like really specific to what your opponents are reading and how that situation plays out. And then it's also, in a way, the last introductory speech where you have the constructive and you have the rebuttal to really set yourself up for collapses in the back half, because this is where, in the front half of the rounds, you're really introducing new content and also giving yourself as many like paths to ballot or like offensive arguments as possible, so then you have more options to choose from in the back half. That's really the I guess like main purpose of rebuttal. It's like to obviously answer your opponent's arguments, but in a way, it's also to sort of introduce as many arguments that you can then go for or set yourself up to collapse on in your later speeches. Oh, also, as like a general note, if anyone has any questions, either like you can raise your hand or just like text in the chat. I'll answer them as you go, and then we'll also leave some time at the end if anyone has like questions then. Okay, so then the second part of like this sort of basic recap is focusing on the different layers of arguments. So when we're answering constructives, we obviously have to look at what these constructive speeches are sort of arguing or what they're reading, right? So when people are building their cases in each contention, they're sort of setting up four layers of arguments. And while there may be more in specific instances, this is the general structure that most contentions will follow. So they'll have a uniqueness argument, a link argument, an internal link argument, and then an impact. So, for example, on any like AF econ argument, they would make a uniqueness argument about like the economy being down, some link argument about how voting AF on the resolution would then boost the economy or enable an economic growth, which is solved back. And then that level of economic growth would be able to reduce poverty or something, and then poverty is bad as your impact. So that would be kind of the structure of a contention. And essentially, with the rebuttal, in its most basic form, you're just attempting to answer. Well, you don't have to like answer all layers of offense, but each response you're making is in some way, even if it's indirectly, it is answering one layer of the arguments that are being made in the constructive. And I think it's a good way to think about it as a form of layering to kind of understand the implication of what the response you're saying is, and sort of a meta understanding of what you're saying and like what it means in the context of the round. And that's like really helpful to think of it as like what are all the layers that I'm responding to. And then it's also good to consider to avoid potentially like contradicting yourself on multiple levels, because that could do something like a double turn, which we'll like kind of cover a little later. So then that like kind of leads into the types of responses you can make. So we've identified the four layers or the main layers of offense and argumentation that are in a sort of debate constructed that you're answering in rebuttal. And when you're answering them, there's a few types of responses you can make, and you probably are all familiar with them. So on the uniqueness level, you can obviously make non-unique arguments, and that is just essentially saying that, well, it's a direct contestation of what the uniqueness is saying, or it's also in a way making the argument that the link itself is not needed. So yes, it's like tagged as a non-unique and it seems intuitive to respond to this, but in a way, it can also address things like the link arguments your opponents are making. So an example of this is if the negative is reading a disad or contention that obviously says that if the resolution were to happen, then something bad were to happen. And a non-unique is just saying, well, that bad thing is already occurring. So it's not really unique to the resolution. It's not a unique harm or negative to what the resolution is saying because it's already happening status quo. So it's not unique. The same thing can be said for the affirmative. If you were to read an argument about solving something or producing a benefit through the affirmative, a non-unique argument would just make the argument that that sort of solution or the problem that you're arguing for is already going away. And I guess in that way, it is also contesting uniqueness because it's saying that the status quo is either worsening or getting better, and even without the plan or the topic. So either way, like even if you're responding to the affirmative or the negative, it's just saying that the link is not really unique. And then On the link level, there's a few, there's like two really main responses. The first is like a D-link or no link. Some judges have a very heavy preference on what they prefer like these to be called. Um, like it really just means the same thing. You're just making a direct defensive response against a link argument that your opponents are making. In this case, that it would just indicate whatever your opponents are saying, for one argument from the resolution to cause an argument that would either produce a solution or negative harm. You're making the argument that that sort of relationship is not true, and that that effect of either voting aff or neg would not cause the scenario that your opponents are proposing. And one general note for all of these sort of terms, I kind of laid out, NUK or DLNL as like a sort of tag, that you would typically see in block files, just so like we're more familiar with them. But inside of rounds in general, you don't necessarily need to read out loud like, oh, this is a D-link or I'm reading a link turn. Instead, it just like kind of helps you to remind yourself, or for like things like block file organization, that you're keeping track of like the responses and what exactly they're saying or what they're indicating. But that's not to say that you have to like read them out loud. And then the second sort of argument on the link level is a link turn. So a turn in general is just where you're kind of taking a part of your opponent's case or the case you're going against, and making it offensive for you. So um, I guess we'll use the econ app example. If like at the very basic level, if the app is making an argument about boosting the economy, a link turn would just say that doing the resolution would produce this other sort of effect that would actually harm the economy, and like the link that they're saying is actually bad. So yeah, like I guess like one example might be like, for example, the app's mechanism of boosting the economy is through like infrastructure construction. You could go for a link turn about infrastructure construction increasing debt or harming the economy in other ways, and then in that essence, you're essentially turning the argument about uh the sort of link or the solvency that the affirmative is going for the economy, and now you're saying that that's actually bad, and in that sense, you're gaining offense and gaining a sort of voter on the arguments that they have initially framed as their offense. The third level is the internal link. So the same sort of defensive responses apply here, because the internal link is just similar to a link in and of itself, because it is also a link. And any sort of defensive response here. And I guess like to clarify, an internal link is between the link itself and the impact. It's like what connects those. And very often like people will just like neglect that, or kind of allow it to go unresponded to. And it's like sometimes like pretty hard to identify a clear internal link to an argument. But like obviously, um, if you do, it's like really helpful to respond to, right? And the same sort of arguments apply here with the link turn now being an internal link turn, and the same sort of logic applies. You're just turning the process, the relationship or the process in which they get between their link scenario and then their impact, and making an argument about why that's actually offense for you, or why the opposite of what they're saying is true. So then that becomes a reason that the judge should vote for you instead of them. The final sort of layer is the impact. And well, this is very typical, like almost every case should have an impact. And the two main responses that any rebuttal should go for here is impact defense and also impact turns. So impact turns are a little less conventional, but they're also becoming more popular now. And this is just like, for example, Spark or Wipeout, where you're just saying the impact that your opponents are making is like, for example, if they're saying that a nuclear war would cause extinction, and you go for something that says nuclear war is actually good, it prevents extinction and doesn't cause extinction itself, then that would be a sort of impact turn, because you're using that impact that your opponent is making an argument about, and now explaining why it's either good or bad to the contrary of what they are saying. And I think a lot more common responses here are, for example, economic decline. That's a very turnable argument, and lots of people will make the sort of impact turn that says that, well, like for example, DDEV or like economic decline is good because it solves for things like warming, or reduces like our development of AI, etc. Um, and a good distinction here is also like you.
बेटे आगे है ये अभी राइट हैंड साइड पे है
Sorry,
थोड़ा
do you have a question,
हाँ
Dari?
वही देखे हम लोग तो आप
I
लोग
think you're
आगे
unmuted.
चलो जाओ
Okay. Yeah, and that kind of reminded me. So a lot of people will read that on economic decline or recession's impacts, a sort of add-on that's like, oh, the terminal impact to recession is that it causes war, right? So in that case, the recession itself, or I guess the link between the recession and the war, isn't necessarily like the impact, because the impact and the terminal impact of that argument is just saying, will a great power war or a war in some essence that is caused by recession would cause extinction or a very large impact. And in that case, you would, if you would turn to, if you were to turn the connection between a recession and this terminal impact of a war, that would be an eternal link term, because you're contesting the relationship between the two and saying, for example, that instead of economic declines causing war, it is actually the opposite because it pacifies countries, it like reduces their resources to put to military aggression, etc. So it would actually decrease the amount of wars that were ongoing. And then the same thing can kind of be said for impact defense. So the most general ones are just like arguments either denying the possibility of causing extinction. So I guess like the main utilization of impact defense, that's like the most common. It's not necessarily like the most useful, but what we generally see is that if since debate is so centered around existential risks or extinction level impacts, especially in tech debate now, that a lot of teams will leverage impact defense to scale down the arguments they're going against to a non-extinction level. So let's say that you are making an argument about climate change being existential, and your opponents are going for an argument about pandemics. So impact defense here would be useful if you were to make reasons why pandemics do not cause extinction. For example, that there are isolated islands or vaccines or quarantine measures that all reduce the risk of it killing us all. And then it kind of lowers the magnitude of your opponent's impact to non-existential, and then you can just weigh it sort of sets up the weighing a little bit better. That the thing though, I guess to note there is that as you can kind of tell, the impact defense itself does not take out the entirety of your opponent's argument, and it does not mean that they can't get an offense of it. It just sort of in itself, impact defense is the idea of mitigation or lowering the amount of offense or utility of the offense that they are gaining to a lower level, and then it kind of sets up other strategies in the back half. For example, weighing or framing issues that kind of utilize the impact defense that you've, I guess, won in the front half to some sort of advantage. Does anyone have any questions on those points? Okay. I guess the next thing I'm going to cover is just like kind of the lay rebuttals, and the next few slides are a little bit just a lot of thoughts, and I'll kind of delve into them. So I wanted to get the layout of the way first, since there's like not too much to say here, but I guess like to start with is in general, as a general note, not just for lay, but you always want to make sure that your rebuttals are organized. So that involves a lot of signposting. And essentially, you just want to note, even on a tech judge, um, you don't tell them exactly, oh, here's the argument I'm responding to. And then another good way to help signpost and help keep everyone's flows in the round organized is by numbering your responses and kind of indicating yeah, like not only what argument you're responding to, but also like here's my first response, second response, etc. Like one, two, three. And that just like helps keep a good line by line on the tech debate. But that all kind of doesn't matter as much on the lay. On the lay, it's still like helpful to kind of indicate, the number of responses you're reading, but it doesn't have to be as like rigid as first, second, third, but like more so like transitioning between the arguments a lot more fluently because obviously they don't care too much about the number of responses you're making necessarily, but more so how I guess persuasive the responses you're making sound to them and like how well they flow together as like sort of attack strategy against your opponent's case, right? And the first main note on the lay rebuttals is that they're a lot more narrative heavy. And this is lay debate as a whole, obviously. Lay debate as a whole is just focusing on the narrative and really being able to tell a story to the judge so that at the end of the round, they can, when they're casting their ballot, they're able to think of exactly the clear main argument on your side and be able to vote for you in that sense. And you don't want to like sort of take the aspects of tech debate where you're essentially just trying to set up as many passive offense as you can, or like sort of abusing like the rebuttal to then like open up a lot of new content. And instead, you want to sort of center a lay rebuttal or more flay rebuttal around advancing the narrative that you've already constructed in your opening case. So I guess like a few things that this means is like the utility of using overviews or early weighing. Um, I'll answer the question in the chat in a second, but so the I guess like the way that focusing on the narrative and the layer rebuttal plays out is like, for example, you'll start it with a one-liner or just like a sort of overview that in first rebuttal, this can even look like just like briefly recapping your case, but also more often than not, the stock arguments that you're reading on lay will directly interact with stock arguments that your opponent is also reading on the lay. So you'll kind of like use an overview to not only extrapolate and remind the judge of your initial arguments and like what your main narrative is, but then in the rebuttal, that's a good time to then apply it and sort of start comparing it and doing comparative analysis as early as possible to the big picture of both sides, right? And that's a really good leeway to kind of set up a sort of meta view on what the judge is saying in terms of the arguments instead of getting in the nitty gritty of they dropped this one specific response. Like a late judge is not going to care too much about that, which is why you want to like mainly balance your focus on the sort of bigger picture and then starting these comparative analysis and also making sure that the responses you're making and I guess the overall structure of your rebuttal plays into your broader narrative. And that's like the whole I guess like goal of a lay strategy in any given round is to slowly build up this narrative that is convincing to a lay and that is like one thoroughly throughout and the rebuttal should not be an exception to that. You should also do things to sort of contribute to that overall picture instead of getting too caught up in the line by line. And that's also I guess like encompassing of the second idea, which is just balancing the big picture and the details of each case. And I think using overviews and early weighing is a good way to help keep yourself in check in that regards because you'll have a sort of 30 seconds to 1 minute at the top of your rebuttal to just like get down the exact like the main big picture narrative that you're talking about, and then the rest of the time you can kind of go down and give some responses directly to each point that they're making. We had a question in the chat that if I thought gaslighting works on most lays. Um, like gaslighting about what was dropped and like how the flow is going, or like you like what specific type of gaslighting?
Oh yeah, I'm the one who sent the question.
Yeah.
Like specifically, I was thinking like if they give a study and you go like, "Oh, our study's better," even though it's not. Like, do you think they'll believe it?
I mean, I don't think that you like have to do that to like it's not like the most strategic thing to do. There's like a couple of things that I would consider with that. The first is that like if you were to gaslight like that, like it's like not the most conventional form, I guess, because if you're called out or like it's like something that's like pretty easily checkable, right? Like in order to make that response, you'd also have to give a reason for why your study in that instance is better. And that requires like some level of warranting in the first place, right? So if you're able to do that, I'm sure like there's ways that you can compare evidence without gaslighting. And at worst, you can just like give analytical reasoning. Like no study applied to debate is like perfect. So I don't think you necessarily have to rely on lying, and I don't necessarily think it's like worth it either. I think there's like some levels of gaslighting that like is somewhat strategic, but like I don't know. I've never like thought about it in the context of evidence comparison. Um, yeah, but like I guess like the risk of that, right, is that it like the bottom line is the judge at any point after the round could just be like, oh, like let me see the two studies, and if they come to a conclusion that's different than what you're presenting them, even if it is like fully conceded in the round, then they're not going to be like very happy about it. And even if like it goes uncontested, like if you make it a big point that hey, we have presented a study and then you're gaslighting them about it being much better than the study that your opponents are presenting. And then the judge is like, oh, this was like a really big point and probably a pretty big reason why I might vote for your team. And then they call for the study and they kind of see for themselves. And they're like, oh, this is like not true at all. They're like lying about their evidence. Like that's just like not the best looks on a lay judge. So like, yeah, I don't know too much about like how strategic that would be. Okay.
Um, Wait, how big on the lay are analytics compared to the tech?
Yeah,
Sorry,
I think
Marcus.
like it, okay, so on the tech, really analytical usage just like varies by your debate style. And I think I have a note on this later, but I think analytics, okay, ideally in lay and tech, analytics are super useful and you should utilize them like whenever needed, right? Um, but I guess like the general norm is that people like I think people read evidence about the same amount. It just like seems like it's less because on a tech you're kind of spreading through like 20 blocks on each argument, whereas on the lay you're maybe only reading three cards per contention and then mixing in one or two analytics, which is the same thing on tech. But I don't think like I think they can also be a little more useful in the sense that like you can kind of get at the logical flaws of debate arguments because like obviously the arguments we make in debate aren't like the most realistic or don't make the most sense, especially like compared to things that we know are probable or true, for example, like historical events. In that sense, um, you can like use analytics to gut check a lot of arguments that are being made, even if these are arguments that are common on the lay, because oftentimes they won't make like the most logical sense or be the most realistic in terms of like what we would expect to be probable or I guess like logical, right? And that's like why analytics can get a lot more leeway instead of lay. But I also like to your question exactly, like between lay and tech debate, I don't think like there's that much of a difference between how useful they are. Like at least in my belief, I think analytics are super useful like in both instances. So but like that definitely does not mean that you shouldn't use analytics on the lay. So yeah, they're like useful in both instances. Okay, this other question. So when you're talking about this topic, do you mean the executive orders one? Um, Adion, I think.
Yeah, like the next one.
Yeah, I haven't done too much prep on it, but I think like so I guess the overviews I'm talking about here are like more so case overviews. So they're in a way like extending your narrative. And then like top level applying it to your opponent's narrative. So it's doing like that meta comparison between your initial narrative and then their narrative as a form of responding to it and starting that early comparative analysis. So I would say that that strategy and that like way of going about a layer rebuttal is good and would work on any given topic. I guess like for your question specifically, like I'm assuming you're meaning more, I guess like defensive or offensive, like actually responsive overviews. I think that I think I could definitely see a lot of utility on it, at least on the lay. I would need to do more prep to talk about the tech, but like I guess off the top of my head, it's just like uh you can talk about sort of general issues of executive orders, like I guess arguments that precede individual executive orders. So let's say that I don't know how cases are going around this, but let's say that there are specific executive orders that that either the AF or NEG is mentioning in their speech to kind of exemplify contentions and form arguments around. And then you can kind of go as an overview, either like top shelf, for example, on the NEG, like here's a few reasons why executive orders don't work, like they only last for a short amount of time, and this in these many instances, like they're struck down by courts or they never produce like long-lasting effects. Like that's sort of a top level sort of response that at least I could see being pretty effective because it challenges the overall assumptions that are or underlying sort of warranting that the arguments that even if they're more specific on each side, that's sort of the underlying notion that they're relying on. So yeah, I can definitely see like an overview being pretty useful, but so yeah, I would probably do a little more prep on that and like find specific overviews. But I guess in the context of the lay overview that I was talking about in this slide specifically, I think they're useful on any topic because it's just really an application of your case and in a way cross applying it to the overall case that your opponent's making. That's like the overview I was, yeah. The final question, I think, for lay judges, are dropped arguments worth pointing out if paired with the comparison of the big picture? Um, so like, are you saying like if they drop an argument, should you point it out? Like, I guess like I might need some clarification for this question. David.
Yeah, so I think you mentioned earlier, let me, I think, um, like you were talking about how specifically for lay judges, oh yeah, basically, I'm sorry, I'm getting really confused right now, but basically, how can we point out dropped arguments so that way we use it in our comparison, like weighing in like overviews without necessarily getting too caught up in like the little details.
So like, are these arguments that you made that they don't respond to, or um,
Yeah, like yeah, when they drop arguments that we make.
yeah, so I think a lot of that comes down to like how you frame it and how you implicate it in the back half of the round, right? Like, I wouldn't say that extending a response on your opponent's contention like proper. Like, I'm not saying at all that you, for example, in the summary or final focus, that you have to only go for an overview in your case as the like pieces of offense or the sort of parts of the narrative that you're going for. Because like yes, you want to be very narrative heavy, but like in a way, you also want to obviously contest their narrative. So if there is something that is dropped, um, you obviously should and want to extend it. Uh, Obviously, like the response you're initially making should be lay friendly and should be a good sort of defensive or offensive response that you can then explain very well on a lay level why it actually matters in the round. And that's the second part is what is really important if you are going to go for these sort of more line by line responses is that first you want to make it very clear that or like I guess like what this response is responding to on their side, but then also on top of just like I guess extending what the argument is, the majority of time in I guess like the back half, based on what the response you read in rebuttal is going to be spent actually explaining why the response matters. Like why does it take out your opponent's argument? Why does it matter? In the general sort of scheme of like what they're saying, and then versus like what you're saying, right? So beyond just saying things like um okay, I'll reuse like the AF econ example again, right? Let's say the affirmative on the left side is making an argument about infrastructure, which is good for your economy, and you make your response saying something like, "Oh, we don't have enough workers, we have a labor shortage, so even if we were to pass spending for infrastructure, we wouldn't actually be able to complete it." So that's like an argument in of itself. Then you want to go the next step and explain like, oh, like why does this actually mean we like can't access the benefits that they're talking about? Well, obviously, like, we wouldn't be able to build the infrastructure or complete these projects without a sufficient amount of workers. So spending in this time would not be good and also be potentially inflationary because it opens a lot of job openings that no one is able to fill, right? And that those like extra layers of analysis are very important on the tech because you always want to have implications or I guess like weighing and comparison based on responses, but definitely more so on the lay because they're not really concerned about, oh, did this team respond to this response? But more so that they would care a lot more if you are making a reason why this response that they did not address matters a significant amount to like the round that you're debating. So I think it just comes down to like implicating, and I definitely think it's worth pointing out if you're like actually doing that. I guess on the flip, if you're kind of just extending it, like there's a chance it'll be worth it, but I think like more often than not, if you're spending 10 seconds on a response, it's just gonna get lost in the bigger picture because they're already having they already have so much like focus on, right? Yeah, if that didn't answer your question, like feel free to ask like follow-ups. I'd be happy to answer. Um, okay, I had another question. Is NSDA Nats tech or lay heavy? Definitely very lay heavy. I think the year I went, I got like maybe one or two techs in my like 12 judges that I had across 6 rounds. So I definitely like focused my strategies on like more like lay debate and more lay argumentation. Since that's like the general, I guess, um, judging makeup that you're gonna have. There's like one note though, is that like there in Nats especially, there's like a lot more traditional coaches. So there'll be like coaches from these schools like that we might not see as much on the national circuit, but that like come to Nats because like Nats is very I guess like national in the sense that like obviously there are teams coming from every state that might not be as involved in the tournaments we go to. And because each round has two judges, there's a chance that you'll get like one very lay new judge like that's a parent, and then also one very traditional or even sometimes leaning technical judge. And in that sense, I think the best thing to do is like you should go lay and you should debate in a lay sort of style so that you're not automatically losing the lay judge, but then also don't sacrifice the flow. And I guess through this like sort of strategy, as long as you can kind of base it off of what your opponents are doing too. Like if they're just obviously kicking the lay, um, then you can like sort of do more technical debate just as long as you're comparatively more lay and also especially in the back half like sort of slowing down, explaining things a lot more. But in general, like I guess like the best sort of thing to prepare for is just like more flay styles of debate. So obviously not losing the flow in case you do have a tech judge in the back of the room, but also the probability of having lays is just like very high. So definitely like focus a lot on that too. Okay. Also, is it better to go for impact comparison or just the biggest impact? So the biggest impact is a form of impact comparison, right? Because you're making the argument that your impact is larger than theirs, which is a form of comparing your impact versus theirs. So in front of a tech judge, I would say like um, it definitely like isn't a bad way of weighing, but there like are other forms of weighing that are also really useful on tech judges. So I don't think it's like the best thing to do. Like if your impact very clearly is larger and is more important than their impact on just a sheer magnitude or sheer severity scale, then I don't think it hurts to mention it because like that's just a very standard form of weighing, and if it's dropped, you can obviously just sign your ballot there. But I also wouldn't like think about it as an either or and restrict yourself to doing one over the other because once again, it is a form of impact comparison. And there are a lot of other ways of comparing your impacts that you can do. Okay. So now just going into some like general thoughts and considerations on like the rebuttal speech. A lot of these are kind of just like notes, so I'll be going a lot more into depth about like what I think about them and also strategic considerations. So yeah, and they're like they're kind of scattered like this because they don't really fit into one sort of main categorization, but they're just general things that we should consider or take note of when we're giving our rebuttals. The first is that like about first rebuttal framing. So I guess like framework or framing issues are ways that you can sort of indicate to the judge here is how you should look at the round, like what lens you should evaluate the round through, and in doing so, you give them I guess a playing field on what impacts they should consider. So when we're looking at things like the most common ones are structural violence or extinction, which SV is like you should focus on even if they're less impactful on a scope or magnitude level, they're like more they're issues that are more ignored and more structural that we should also consider versus extinction framework, which is just like you should only vote on existential impacts or you should prioritize them the highest because extinction is the worst thing that can happen. It's the largest impact, right? And I guess the utility of them in rebuttal is so first is the first sort of thing here is a second rebuttal framing is generally like looked down upon because well you're really pushing back the amount of interaction engagement that can happen over your framework and in framing considering it's such like a top level and important issue to how the round plays out. So more often than not judges will be very I guess like not happy if you introduce framing in the second rebuttal because you also had the instant I guess in a way in PF is that you also had your second constructive speech where you knew what your opponents are reading and then you can make the strategic decision then if framework or framing was strategic considering what they're reading, right? So let's say they read a straight case that didn't have any extinction impacts and it was more like traditional with arguments about like things like recessions or I guess like non-extinction impacts. And then if you see that in in first constructive, then you can make the strategic decision in second constructive to read framing. You don't have to like wait for second rebuttal. And if you do that, it's kind of like pushing back the line at which like the interaction with that framing starts, which just makes it like really, I guess, blippy in the back half because of the time constraints there. And the other sort of reason for that is that the first rebuttal is making their arguments under the assumption that either there is no framing or whatever framing was established in a constructive is going to stay, right? If you introduce a new framing in second rebuttal, then it potentially just frames out all of the arguments that the first rebuttal is making, which is like pretty unfair and like skewed, and it's potentially like a sort of theoretical argument there. But with that being said, though, first rebuttal framing is like more permissible because so sort of for the same reasons that I touched upon with second constructive framing, it's the first time you're like considering the overall, I guess like impacts of like what the second constructive is saying, and that you can make the strategic decision if it is possible or good to be able to read a framework and then frame out any sort of pieces of offense that your opponents are reading, right? So the same scenario applies if they're reading non-extinction level impacts or they're maybe reading only sort of these big stick impacts, then you can choose based on that if you want to read things like extinction or SV in the first rebuttal. And then that itself is strategic because it's sort of acting as a framing issue to indicate throughout the entire round, and depending on like no matter how the round plays out, if you were to go for this, the lens in which arguments should be considered, and potentially like just ruling out arguments entirely if they like don't fall under that sort of categorization. And that's like useful as a sort of rebuttal argument, in a general sense of like what a rebuttal is, because it's allowing you in most instances to essentially just like say this whole argument as a whole should not be considered within the scope of this debate, right? So all the responses we are making are attesting the truth or the importance of individual arguments that are being made in the round. Like if you read a D-link, if you read a no-link, if you read a link turn, etc., they're like directly, I guess, like piecing apart each of the arguments that the other team is making and then saying why they're not true or that they're not important in the context of this round. But with framing, especially in first rebuttal, I guess based on their constructive, you can kind of just like take to get the whole argument together and just say that it's not something that we should like consider within the scope of this debate. Okay, the second sort of I guess like strategy or like thoughts and consideration is that it is offense heavy rebuttals. So referring back to something we covered in the basic recap, which is that rebuttal is like really the last introductory speech where you're able to introduce new content and then also leverage new offense or new defense or just basically like new argumentation that you can then utilize later in the back half, which is why you want to use it to set yourself up as best as possible to have like different collapse avenues or very fleshed out and nuanced collapse avenues that you'll be able to win the battle with. So one way that you could do this is by putting a lot of offense in your rebuttal. So now, especially if your first rebuttal, even if your second rebuttal, but let's start with first rebuttal, right? If you have read now 4 minutes of offense, 4 minutes of reasons to vote for you in your constructive speech, and then you read like 3 minutes or 3 to 4 minutes of more offense in first rebuttal, you're now giving the second rebuttal 8 minutes of content that they have to respond to in 4 minutes. And remember that they're not only responding to, oh yeah, I guess yeah, you're basically just making it so that they have like 8 minutes of offensive issues that they have to respond to in just 4 minutes. So it's like a very big time scale in the second rebuttal. And then any sort of issue on the offensive level that is dropped, especially in tech debate, is like a very good way that you can then just go for that in the back half because it's a sort of offensive issue that was not properly addressed, was not properly frontline or responded to in their speech. So just like dumping that much offense can like easily overwhelm the second rebuttal. And the same thing can be said for if you're doing the strategy in second rebuttal and sort of applying that pressure on first summary, because now they have to like extend, start weighing on top of answering a lot of turns or offensive arguments that you're making in the second rebuttal, which like puts a lot of pressure, is also overwhelming. And yeah, that's like the main sort of thing that's going on with offensive heavy rebuttals. They're definitely like very strategic in some instances, especially if you have a lot of diverse turns to read and you think that it would be able to win you the round either by sort of overwhelming their ability to address other parts of the flow or by just reading so many turns that inevitably one of them is going to be undercovered or dropped, and then you can just put all of your I guess time into going for that one argument. So a few things here is that first, straight turns. So these are arguments you're making against your opponent's contentions, where really the only things you're doing is one, reading counter uniqueness, and then two, reading only turns. So the reason that this is important is because if you read a defensive response, but then also read a turn, depending, so not in all circumstances, but in most cases, this will mean that if they concede the defense, this will in some way be able to take out the turn. And I guess like one way this can be seen is like, um, I'm trying to think. Well, I guess like on an impact defense level, so we talked about why it's mitigation, but let's just say that they're reading an argument about like pandemics, right? And then you make a link turn that voting for you is actually better for solving pandemics, but then also make a response about why pandemics aren't like important or don't cause extinction. They can concede the defense, and that means the turn doesn't have as much value or importance, right? So yeah, like making sort of these different levels of responses also opens the opportunity for your opponent to then go, okay, I'll agree with one of these points, which is only defensive, which then takes out or at least mitigates the amount of offense or significance that you're garnering off of this other response that could potentially be more damning for me. The other important thing to note here is the counter uniqueness, right? So when you're reading turns in themselves are offense, but if you're not reading counter you need this, then they kind of don't become as offensive, right? So I guess that one way to visualize this is that if you are reading linked turns against your opponent's arguments, but you don't respond to you need this, so let's say that they are the neg, right? And they're saying that the status quo is improving, and then you're like, okay, but um, doing the off would create these improvements rather than the harms that they are talking about. But if you have conceded that the status quo is already improving, then that in itself is sort of a non-unique to the turn you're making, because you're agreeing with, or you're implicitly agreeing with the way that they have said the status quo is going, and in doing so, you're not creating uniqueness for the turn that you're going for because you then can't win an impact. So in order to win the impact they are talking about, you then have to paint a different picture of what's going on right now and then make the argument about why their argument is actually a reason why voting for you would either be able to solve the situation or it would only make it worse, right? Depending on if you're off or neg. But that sort of analysis is why counter uniqueness is so important and why if you're going for a straight turn, you still have to win a competing you need this evidence or a competing you need this scenario. Otherwise, the other team can just leverage their you need this and just say, okay, even if the turns are true, they have conceded you need this, which means that none of the turns have impacts because either the status quo is already improving or it's already getting worse, so they're not unique. Real quick, we have
Okay,
a question in the chat.
just one thing. So like even if it's on the lay or the tech, like someone reads like either a squirrely or cases that you don't have blocks to, what's your strategy for going in and writing analytics and filling in that 4 minute time frame? Of course, if you're second, it's easier, but like let's say
Yeah,
first
yeah.
rebuttal.
So I was gonna touch on that next for my analytic point. I guess I'll just like kind of start answering it then. So for more analytical arguments, um, so once again, tying back to like one of the points I made earlier, which is just that a lot of the arguments that we are applying to debate just aren't that realistic, right? Inherently, debate and the arguments we make in PF are chaining a bunch of different arguments together, and each sort of chain we're making lowers the probability that that is true, right? Because we're just like, I guess, like in a way, artificially connecting all of these arguments, and there will inevitably be problems either with the connections or even with the original argument that is being made. So let's say that if there's a completely squirrely argument that you've just never seen before, I guess the first thing to do is oh, okay. There's no like exact order of the way that you should do things, but one thing to consider is that no matter how square the impact is, sorry, no matter how square the argument is, they still have to have an impact, right? And that impact itself is well, if it wants to scale up to something that is large, well, it's probably something that you're going to have responses to. So even the most squirrely arguments or link scenarios will tend to have somewhat of a stock impact. So that is the first layer of argumentation that you can address your attention to if you're not able to, I guess, like respond to the rest of it as properly, right? But I guess if you want to like directly clash a bit more with what they're saying, an important thing to do is read their evidence. So um, look through the email chain, kind of see what they're saying, but then also look at the parts that they're not highlighting, right? In a lot of instances, there will be parts of the card that kind of put doubt or at least mitigate what they're saying to a lower level because very few authors, especially in like these large studies or even in a lot of the arguments that the authors themselves are making will be like 100% certain that they are correct and they'll always like put some level of analysis or a consideration of the entire picture, right? So this is one perspective that they're taking, but then there's also the counterfactual of like the opposite could be true or the opposite is true. And you just want to kind of like skim through evidence and at least like contextualize their argument. So the first thing, like obviously, when you're seeing an argument that you don't know or you're not familiar with, is familiarizing yourself with that argument. And once you become more familiar with it and like understand the general context, then it just becomes a lot easier to think about responses or think about reasons why the argument that they are making is not so true, right? And I can actually pull up an example of this in oh, I didn't mean to mute. Let me pull up an example real quick, and then we can like see like what I mean specifically. Okay. All right, should be shared again. So this is my case file for AF on the TOC topic, which is nuclear energy. And I think at least to me, I ran some like pretty non-stock or like some little unconventional arguments. And I'll just like give an example of what I was saying with analytics, right? So obviously, like no evidence is going to be 100% perfect, and if it is, then the connections they're making or like the link chain that they're making is not going to be as sound either. Like there's always going to be flaws of a case. So in this case, the argument that's being made here is that stratospheric aerosol injections are coming out. Like you don't have to understand the entirety of the argument, but this is just that you need this claim, right? And then obviously, when you first hear this argument, it might be like, okay, I don't like really know what's going on. But when you read through the evidence, there's always going to be parts that are kind of disagreeing with the what they're saying, right? So here, as we're reading through, we kind of see that um, the argument that's being made is that this form of geoengineering, which is SAI, is becoming more likely because, well, under Trump, like they're not really regulating, and then the private sector is dominating, and people like Elon Musk are like pushing for this approach. But then right under it, right, like what's not really highlighted is that there's the author is making an argument that also, or I guess an analysis of what the status quo looks like that also isn't 100% certain. So obviously they're going to include things that decrease the certainty of that argument. So here we kind of see that much remains uncertain about like the new administration's stance, and that there's a chaotic counterweight because of RFK Jr., who's a chemtrails conspiracy theorist and has vowed to like ban geoengineering. So even if like the argument itself is not, I guess like the most key part of the article, or it's not going to be like terminal, that at least gives you something to say, right? And it's also like something that's in their own evidence, which you can leverage against them as a key point. It's like, oh, well, your evidence doesn't 100% say that's going to happen. It in fact gives a counter warrant as to why it's potentially unlikely to happen. And then I guess like in this specific instance, all you need to do is that compare like your warrant versus theirs, right? So the debate would just come down to, well, first of all, like I guess like is RFK gonna ban it? And that's like something that's like obviously up for contention, but more importantly is like who has more influence in the government, right? Is it like these private sector actors or is it RFK who's the health secretary? And that's something like you can leverage, I guess like looking at their evidence and like seeing what they're saying is making it not so certain and then spinning it in a way that makes it so that your arguments are more probable. And the same thing can be said for like any of these arguments. So I guess like even looking at the next card, right? Um, if I remember correctly, yeah, so this is the this card was just saying next that like SAI or stratospheric aerosol injection, so the form of geoengineering that was being talked about in this case would cause war because it would entail like a manipulation or altercation of the environment against other countries' wishes. Um, and so yeah, on face it's like okay, well I'm not too familiar with this argument. Like I don't know if SAI is going to cause war or not, but the article itself also will go into kind of like the considerations and everything that's like enveloping around what their argument is saying, right? So if we kind of just read in between the lines, etc., the parts about which talk that talk about things like perceiving the threat as grave to justify use of force, they also say that there would be no doubt diplomatic efforts within the international community to dissuade the government from engaging in a program unilaterally, and also things like sanctions being imposed, right? So I guess like that's one thing is that you can kind of just like look through the non-highlighted or non sort of formatted parts of the card, or even just opening the hyperlink, reading through parts of their evidence. And obviously you don't want to spend all your time doing that because if you don't find anything, well then you've wasted a lot of your prep time. But I definitely think like at least giving a skim, especially since you have the email chain in most tech rounds, while they're reading, you can kind of understand the argument better by yourself by just like looking at the evidence itself, right? But on top of this, it also kind of like uh, I guess like exposes beyond the card itself, considering these alternative possibilities that you could argue are more probable. For example, it's more probable that countries will use diplomacy or sanctions to stop the US doing SAI versus just automatically like launching a war against it. But that's also a response. You don't really need to read the evidence to say, right? You can just like kind of think about, well, what is like infeasible about their situation? Like analytically, off the top of my head, I can just be like, okay, well, even if we do things like geoengineering programs, like it just isn't the most reasonable or realistic response for other countries to just skip every other procedure and go to war. And then yes, they might make responses about like okay, well, these other procedures won't work, or the US won't bend down to like other forms of pressure that are not militaristic. But then you could just contest those as well, because then it just becomes a debate about analytics, and the logic will more often than not go to your side, because in debate arguments are the arguments that we are spinning tend to like be less true than they are true. So in this case, even if they say things like, um, well, the US wouldn't fall to these levels of pressure, you can then do analytical analysis on the incentives of the US, and why they don't necessarily want to cause these military provocations. Like, it would obviously be against our interests as well. Does that kind of answer your question? So like, I guess like
Yeah.
in general, it's just like assessing what parts of the squirrely argument are the most unrealistic and infeasible, right? Because I guess the main reason you're not familiar with the argument, or you have not heard it before, is because it's not the most true argument. That's what makes squirrely arguments like squirrely, right? Like, no one's really considering it when they're doing their prep or their research, because it's not in the mainstream literature, and there's obviously a reason for that. So either by reading the evidence or kind of like thinking about which parts of the argument are the least probable, that's how you can like identify like the major gaps in what they're saying. Okay. Yeah, going back to what I was saying before. Yeah, so quickly we were finishing up offensive heavy rebuttals, and one other thing is that you shouldn't pigeon yourself into only, I guess, like trying to give offensive heavy rebuttals. So yes, they are useful in some circumstances or some instances where you have a plethora of turns against an argument, for example, but you don't always have to do that. And I think especially with my rebuttals, what I like doing more is I like highly prefer reading smart defense over lots of offense. And I just think like it's more effective. It's also more efficient to read smart defense, and then you can probably allocate time better on other arguments. And the other thing is that you can kind of balance these. So in a normal tech round, they'll have like 3 to 4, maybe 2 contentions. You can like address. You can straight turn some of the arguments. For example, if they read a stock argument that you have like 8 turns prepped, well, then you can just straight turn that, right? There's no reason why you really shouldn't. But then on arguments where you're less sure what you should do and you already are running out of time, like, you should never like put down the ability to use smart defense that in a more efficient manner can just take out what they're saying, and then instead try to go for turns. And the reason that this is also important to consider is that turns aren't necessarily going to take out what they're saying, right? They're instead making a counterfactual issue to then frame their argument as offensive for you. And we'll kind of touch into why that's like not necessarily a effective rebuttal if they are able to spike out of these turns or do some top level analysis, because in a way you're still not really contesting the truth of the link itself on a defensive level or the impact itself. You're giving them the impact, right? At the very least, because you're turning it, you're turning the way that they get to that impact. And if they can beat back the link turns, well, then they have a very clear path to offense. And we'll touch on to that when we go to second rebuttal frontlining. The next thing is like double turns. So this is what I was kind of getting at with the different layers of argumentation, which is that if you read a link turn, but then read an internal link turn, you're obviously double turning yourself, or the same thing can be said if you read a link turn and then an impact turn. Basically, like any turns on these different levels could potentially be offensive for them, right? You're sort of turning yourself, because what you're saying is that, well, if the link between the resolution and their case is false and it actually goes the other way. So let's say that you're saying something on an economic argument that's like, okay, actually voting for the AF is bad for the economy, but then you say um, on like the impact level that economic decline is good. Wait, yeah, something like that, right? So now you are the neg and you're saying that well, it would actually be a harm to economy if you were to vote AF, but then you're also turning the impact and saying that economic decline is good, then you're double turning yourself, because you're now making an argument that if you vote for the neg, you would cause economic growth. You would not cause economic decline, but then that would not allow economic decline to happen, which you have also said is a good thing. So do you see it like I guess like it kind of like goes back on itself, and then means that you're sort of giving them another path to offense, because they can just agree with the, I guess, more impactful turn, which is just that the internal link turn. And in agreeing with that, they can agree with both and just be like, okay, then this is a reason to vote for us, because they have just made a turn on the link level and then a turn on the internal link or impact level. And in doing so, that's like a double turn. And obviously, you need to explain and extrapolate that argument, explain why it's offense for you. But Yeah, so I would just avoid trying to go for like too many turns on those different levels, and that's also why like being able to visualize and identify like what layer of argumentation you're responding to is important to avoid contradicting yourself. The other thing is that a lot of cases, especially on the tech, are going to have a lot of spikes or preemptions against potential responses you can make. So the last thing you want to do is kind of give a 4-minute rebuttal of a lot of good content, but then they go up there and just be like, okay, well, this is spiked out, and just re-explain every component of their case, the warrants that you might have missed. And in doing so, like now none of your responses really have any weight because these were just arguments that were dropped from their constructive speech that they made explicitly to preempt potential responses you can make. So once again, a good way to identify this is, well, obviously you want to be very actively flowing and sort of listening to each part of their case, but then also reading through the evidence, trying to identify anything that could be spun as a potential response to what you are going to plan on responding to their case with. And you want to respond to spikes. You want to obviously, if you identify spike or see that a potential for the preemption, you can preempt the preempt or just like address the spike that has already been made, right? And just you can still make the response, but then you have to do one layer extra of analysis and explain why it supersedes or takes out what they are saying. And I don't like have a great example of this, but like if they were to read a spike and you read a response, then the next thing you do after reading the response is just like explain why the spike is wrong or it doesn't take out the response. And in a way, you're just backlining in your original rebuttal because they have implemented a front line in their constructive. And that's like a good way to think about it. The final thing is that you want to avoid groupable responses. So if you have too many responses that are just like really saying the same thing, not only is that inefficient, but it's like really easy to respond to if they can just make one response that takes out all of them. And this might be a little hard to identify at first because you're wanting to, especially on the tech level, to like introduce as much content as possible. But I guess like one way to do that is like kind of like think about your rebuttal strategy as a whole in essence and kind of recap before you like decide what to read. Like, okay, so like what is the implication or what is this argument really saying? Does it rely on the same notions and the same underlying warrants or I guess arguments inside of the round for your response to be true? And if that is the case, and multiple arguments are sort of relying on this one core component, then if they responded to that core component, then you would kind of lose all the utility of the rest of the arguments you're making. So that's like definitely something to think about and try and avoid. Okay, the next set of things, the first is disads or advantages. So these are kind of adopted from policy rebuttals where in that sense you're kind of introducing new arguments as a response to the arguments that were already being made by either the alpha or the neg, right? And in essence, these are just new contentions that are being read in rebuttal. And that's why for a long time the alpha was reading disads, which like obviously is a neg sort of tagline argument. But these are just sort of new contentions, new arguments that you could read in case, but now you're choosing to read in rebuttal. So I think that more often than not, disads or advantages are not the most strategic, simply because you're, I guess, exhausting a good portion of time, like 30 to 45 seconds, of when you can be reading more specific content, even more specific offense in the form of turns against what your opponent is reading. Because now you have to spend that time reading a pre-written argument that you're also not really setting up to be that successful, and they can just read, like, for example, pre-written blocks too. So it's not the most efficient use of time, but I will say there are some exceptions to when it is a strategic decision. The first is like what we were kind of talking about before, which is when you're going against a more squirrely argument. And if you truly cannot think of things like say as much, well then you can potentially just read a disad or advantage in rebuttal and um, spend that time reading that new piece of offense instead of making responses because you don't have potentially like, as many responses to make. But the second instance is when it is an argument that is so important or that really responds to the overall arguments that they are making. And that's in that case, the disad or the advantage would be a form of an overview, right? Because it's a top shelf response. But in both of these instances, I think the most important thing to take note of is that you always want to implicate or weigh the offense you're going for. And we'll kind of talk about this with the turns as well, and what you should be doing with the offense you read in rebuttal. But if you are to introduce this new argument, you don't want to just kind of like leave it floating, right? Because you want to explain and set up the framing of why this argument matters, why you're reading it in rebuttal. And more often than not, the reason you're reading it is because you want to implicate it to take out the arguments that they're reading or weigh it against them, right? And you want to introduce that analysis as soon as possible to kind of set it up and then also be able to extend on it and go for it in the back half. So I think that's the utility of going for a disad or advantage and reading it in rebuttal is being able to implicate it and weigh it against with the arguments that they are making. But you definitely want to explain why it matters and why it is like a rebuttal response and not just like something that you're reading to get more offense. I guess like floating out there.
How do you introduce the disads in rebuttal? Like, do you just start off by reading a new contention, or do you like?
Um, Yeah, like you don't necessarily have to flag it as a disadvantage, but typically like you will want to read it at the very top because kind of what I was talking about, it is like a top shelf response. You could just say like, oh, it's gonna be like an overarching response, it's gonna be a new argument, like anything sort of flies in that case. But yeah, you generally want to read it first, and you do want to like flag it as something that you're reading. You don't want to just like go into the speech being like, okay, it's going to be starting on their case like C1, C2, and then the judge is like, okay, but this is a completely new argument. If that sort of answers your question. Okay. Yeah, and the next thing I was going to get into is weighing in implications. So every piece of offense that you read in the round should be weighed and implicated. And that's like obviously how the offense is going to be evaluated through the lens of the judge. But one really strategic thing you can do inside of your rebuttals is to implement the weighing and implications earlier on, right? So if you can not even hide, but just incorporate the comparative analysis and also purpose and I guess like meta level explanation of why the argument you're making matters in the general context of the round, then it is a lot more I guess both efficient and also helpful to then go for these arguments in the back half because you already have a setup of here's the argument you're making, but also here's the analysis about why it matters. And if either one of those parts gets dropped, well, then you have something that you can kind of leverage and utilize against their case. And another reason why this is important, especially in the rebuttal, is that too often people will flow rebuttals or even flow constructives off the doc, but more so rebuttals where you don't obviously have to put all the stuff on the doc that you're sending out. Most people don't send analytics, and definitely you don't need to send the weighing or implications that you're doing, especially if they're off the flow or off the top of your head. So more often than not, some people will drop a piece of weighing or a piece of implication off a response, then that you can just blow up because it's like conceded weighing. So as long as you win the turn to some extent, then you can just go for that, and there's no way they can come back from it because it was a conceded response from your rebuttal. So like incorporating, even if it's a shorter line, just something like prereq because like the economy can't grow for an award, like something like that. It is like really useful to sort of do that level of analysis and take the extra step in an earlier speech to because it just sets up your later speeches so much more. And that's also something I would say that is a sort of strategy if you're going against some more unfamiliar cases or just in general, which is that you don't want to always be quantity over quality. You always want to make sure that there's a good balance between the two and also that your responses have a good value inside the round and have sort of utility. Otherwise, you're just reading stuff to read it, which like isn't going to be that useful and it isn't going to help you win the round that much, right? But if you have those layers of analysis and the reasons why the arguments matter earlier on, especially as soon as you're like introducing them, well, then now they're a lot more fleshed out and nuanced. And applying that to when you're going against less familiar arguments, more squirrely ones, if you just spend a lot of time explaining a single or one or two responses and then actually implicating and I guess like doing that extra layer, extra explanations and extra reasoning on top of that, that can also be a lot more useful than just reading like 5 or 6 analytics or blocks against a stock contention because now you can really dissect and really take apart their argument at its core, right? So yeah, definitely like there are two strategies that are like are very different, but it like you should definitely balance them, but they're both important to consider. So either like kind of going all in and just like dumping a bunch, but also the strategy of just like taking a few like a lot fewer responses, then spending that extra time to implicate, weigh, and explain each of these responses a lot more, which in and of itself is also difficult for them to respond to because now, yes, they have to respond to their response itself, but they also have to be worried about the implication or the weighing value that is coming off of this response. Okay, the next thing is like answering time selects. So this is just a quick note that if you identify an argument that your opponents are reading that only took them 30 seconds to read, it does not make much sense for you to spend more than 30, like even 40 seconds is a little bit much because you don't want to be, you want to be allocating your time in rebuttals, kind of mirroring the way that they allocate their time in constructive because it tells you either how fleshed out their arguments are or how important they think their argument is to their strategy. If you're spending 2 minutes on an argument, it's probably pretty fleshed out. There's probably a lot going on, multiple links, multiple impacts that you want to allocate time to dissecting to an equally fleshed out level so that you're not dropping things. Whereas they spend 30 seconds on a time suck that's just a uniqueness link impact, well, then you can spend the same amount of time, just read 3 quick responses or smart defense, smart turns, etc., that efficiently take out the argument, but then also leave you more time to respond to other arguments. Okay, the next thing to touch on here is condensing warrants and also going against condensed warrants. So a lot of times the cards, especially like in tech debate, like now we'll see people read these like sort of larger cards that have a lot of different warrants hidden in them, and that's sort of like referred to as like condensing these warrants, where a lot of them are like hidden, they're not in the tagline explicitly, and also in reality, this card is making maybe 3 or 4 different responses against your argument, whereas the tagline, or it's just really like one response altogether, although it's making a bunch of different warrants. So that is something that you should utilize definitely in these cards to highlight them efficiently, efficiently, obviously highlight your blocks efficiently, but then also if you have like these good blocks that are making multiple different warrants, you can utilize them and there's a good chance that at least one of the warrants inside of the card is going to go unresponded to, and then you can just go for that as the response itself instead of going for all the warrants. So that's like the utility, I guess, of condensing these warrants and having a good article or good block that kind of makes a bunch of different arguments against them. So they can't just look at the tagline and be like, okay, so this is only one response. I'm only going to make one frontline to it, right? Now they have to spend more time against it. And the same thing for answering condensed warrants. That's another reason why, again, you should actively be flowing these rebuttals very carefully and also, I guess, checking the evidence and making sure that you understand all of the components of what they're saying. Because if you miss condensed warrants, it's probably going to get blown up if your opponents are like catching on to that. So yeah, that's something you don't want to miss. The other thing is I guess the next thing is second rebuttal restarts. So this is I guess like a little more memey or like not that serious, but it's like sometimes like a fine strategy, especially on like a hypertech, because like I guess like in reality it is pretty hard to respond to. Um I guess like you could make theory arguments against it, but on a substance level, this just looks like for example, if you're going second and the first rebuttal is making arguments such as impact defense against your case, where they're saying, okay, the arguments you're making don't cause extinction, right? So let's say you originally read like pandemics and they're reading nuclear war. So in their first rebuttal, they're reading a bunch of defense against your case, it's not true, etc. And pandemics don't cause extinction. So you can then agree, like just kick case completely and second rebuttal restart. So you would just be and I guess the examples here are you would solely be going for impact turns because you would just be entirely I guess getting rid of your initial narrative that or like that like pandemics cause extinction or etc. Or I guess even a better example here that would be more applicable to what a restart looks like is if you initially read a nuclear war impact as well. So both sides are reading nuclear war, but then your opponents read a bunch of defense against your scenario. So you conceded defense to either kick out at the turn or just make sure that they cannot that there is no offense that is linking to nuclear war on your side, but that there is offense on that is linking to nuclear war on their side, and then your entire second rebuttal is just structured around impact turning that. And that's obviously really hard to respond to because it gives them a 4-3 it gives them a 3-4 skew against like 4 minutes of new content that they probably aren't expecting. And yeah, that's the example for Spark because I guess like if you were to execute that strategy, what it would look like is that they're spending their 4 minutes explaining like in its entirety, even if they were to make link turns, the end result would be you being able to concede specific pieces of defense to then mean that there is no offense on your case. So voting for you would not solve or avert nuclear war, whereas voting for them would solve or avert nuclear war. And then you spend your entirety of the time then impact turning that idea, and it kind of like restarts I guess where the debate is going or playing out. And the same thing applies to wipeout. Wipeout is the argument that extinction or death is good. And if you at some point concede, I guess like it would look like you conceding defense on your case to explain why your arguments don't cause extinction, but their arguments now do because you haven't necessarily responded to them yet since they are first rebuttal, and then going for arguments about why them being able to solve extinction is a bad thing because the extinction is good, etc. Okay, so that's about it on second rebuttal restart. Like it's not that much of a strategy. Like I think there are certain rounds where they would be useful, but definitely they're a little bit less serious. And also like you want to make sure that you have the right judge for it. Because it's very like I guess like technical thing to do. It's also like not very nice. All right. The next and like final thing on this slide is like defensive offensive overviews. So this was kind of what we were talking about earlier about the applications of overviews to the executive orders topic. So the lay overview I was talking about was more so about extending your narrative, extending your case, and then applying it to their case. But for more defensive or offensive overviews that you read in rebuttal, these are just general top shelf responses that kind of take out the once again the underlying notions, the general thesis that your opponent's cases rely on. So, for example, on the February topic, which is about the U.S. ratifying the Roman Statute or joining the ICC, a good neg overview against an AF case that is all about like the ICC being able to create peace or restrain the U.S., I guess, would be an overview about why the ICC is at the top level ineffective. If you win that the ICC is ineffective, well, then obviously the entire merits of their case just kind of goes away because that is the notion that all of their arguments rely on, no matter what the specific scenario they're reading, because it all relies on the ICC being effective. For example, being able to restrain the U.S. in areas like cyber, in areas like autonomous weapons, etc. Now, if you're winning reasons why, for example, its member states won't sanction or take action against the U.S. because they care more about their alliances, or the ICC has no like formal enforcement procedure. Well, then the sort of credibility of their arguments at the top level, because they all rely on that notion, then goes away. And that's why like overviews are really useful in responding to these cases that are like groupable in some way because they can just efficiently get that response across the entire board instead of having to make their response to each individual contention that you're then responding to. And that's also an important note to make when you're making cases, which is that you want to avoid the potential for your opponents to read these sorts of responses. And that just like looks like being a lot more cautious and I guess thinking about the potential for grouping the arguments you're making and making sure that you're sort of diversifying the responses you're making. Oh yeah, and the idea of diversification I think applies to like almost all forms, all components of debate, and it also definitely applies to rebuttal in general, where you want to be diversifying the arguments you're making so that it makes it as complex as possible for your opponents to get out of different responses, such as being able to respond to defense on multiple layers of their arguments and not letting them leverage, one really good link, but now they have to defend their entire contention because you're attacking it on multiple different layers. Another example of an overview is just like on the April topic, which is about nuclear energy. If you read an overview that nuclear energy takes too long on the neg, while this doesn't necessarily take out every off argument, the purpose of this overview would be to kind of introduce the early weighing of like time frame for your side, or in some instances it could also take out their arguments, especially if they are reading a fast scenario on the off, such as like an imminent threat that is coming in like months or a few years, then obviously like a nuclear power plant or a nuclear solution that takes over like a decade to construct and complete would not be able to like solve that, unlike what the affirmative is saying, right? So you can also think about beyond the pure defensive purposes of the overviews, like what they can kind of do for setting up the way the round plays out, whether it be through weighing or I guess like mitigating your opponent's like overall narrative as a whole. Okay, the last sort of thing I want to touch on today is just like some specific things to second rebuttal. So obviously the most of the thoughts and considerations apply to both first and second rebuttal, but second rebuttal is a little different because, well, this is not just a speech where you're interacting with your opponent's arguments, but now you also have to frontline your own case. And I guess the first thing to say here is that when you're frontlining across the board, even summary and file, but this is a tip that you should apply, but I guess like I'm applying it here because we're talking about frontlining, right? And that's to leverage your case. And we kind of touched on this already, which was things like using the uniqueness that was so if they're reading strict turns, but then they don't contest the uniqueness, or they contest the uniqueness badly, right? You can just use uniqueness to take out the turns that they're making and just say that they don't have an impact because now they're not unique. Or another example, and one thing that I did a lot on the January topic, which is Somaliland, was that you can utilize the link and weigh it against the link terms, right? Because essentially what is happening is the link terms in and of themselves aren't always directly responsive to your link. They could just be reasons why the topic is actually creating negatives for the issue you're talking about rather than the positives that you're talking about. So a good example of this is on the Somaliland topic where um, I read an argument about terrorism on the app that was like had a couple of links. Two of them were just like, oh, it like enables Somaliland to like build up its military and like get military aid and overall increase its, I guess, like security apparatus. And then also, it would incentivize like Somalia to strengthen its governance to stop like other regions from seceding or becoming independent, right? And people would very often make arguments, for example, like link turning by making the Ethiopia argument against the Ethiopia terrorism argument. I think it was Ethiopia. Yeah, it was some sort of terrorism argument about counter-terror cooperation and also recruiting or radicalization, right? So yes, now these are two offensive issues that are in contention with each other, but they're not necessarily like they're not mutually exclusive, right? They can both be true things, and then now the only thing you have to do is explain why your argument it's just like an issue of link weighing, right? And what I would commonly say is things like, okay, well, even if radicalization or recruiting were to go up, it is irrelevant. One, because terrorism is already high in the status quo, so it's try or die. And two, and most importantly, between the two links, if we increase security and increase governance as a whole, it means that no matter how much radicalization or recruiting goes up, they will always be cracked down on, and terrorism attacks will always be stopped because of the affirmative links. So you don't have to just view those arguments in abstracts or I guess distinctly from each other because they definitely do have interactions and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. You can read a link turn to that still concedes the link that is being responded to, but that is why as a person who's frontlining, then you want to think about if you can leverage that link and still be able to win offense and compare it to then take out the argument that they're making, right? Okay. Yeah, so you need this link. Obviously, you can leverage other parts of your case and other things for efficiency. Like obviously you want to do things like evidence comparison, word comparison, or um yeah, like just any sort of analysis using spikes as well. That's just more generic for aligning stuff. So we won't touch on that too much. If you have questions, like obviously feel free to ask. The next thing is like time split between your case and theirs. In general, I don't think anything over 1 minute and 30 seconds, 1 minute and 30 seconds of frontlining is like necessary or good. And that's why, like, especially in second rebuttal, if you're like if you're a second and you're giving the second rebuttal, it's very hard and you shouldn't like go into that thinking that you'll be able to frontline everything. So one interesting thing that you could do is that you can kind of semi-frontline one contention, right? And if you do that, as long as you're like addressing the turns, or it's a contention that they only read defense to, or you just respond to the turns and like semi-respond to the defense, what it does is it forces your opponent to then spend time responding to that contention in their summary speech, even if you never intended to go for it, right? And that time spent would be like, okay, you spend like 10 seconds just like semi frontlining it, but not really addressing it to the best of your ability because well, you kind of want to bait them into responding to it. And that's like something like kind of like fake frontlining. It's obviously really annoying to deal with, but I think it could be strategic in some instances where you want to just like waste their time and kind of give a false impression. But also like I guess more conventionally and more that's something that's more standard is just like either grouping a bunch of responses because like for 4 minutes of content if you're just like dumping stuff there's probably going to be some stuff that like you can either leverage your case to take out as a whole or the responses are basically just saying the same thing maybe a little different but they all rely on some overall argument that if you just address that then all the responses go away, right? So that's one way to be efficient is grouping, but also strategically kicking out of arguments. So if you're reading a time suck and they spend a lot of time on it, well, great, your purpose is achieved. You can just kick the time suck and allocate your time to frontlining your case and then spending the rest of it responding to theirs. or it's just like making concessions, like kicking defense in one case, on one contention, and then spending the time on another. Like you're probably not going to be able to get the best of all worlds and just run everything perfectly, because either you'll drop something on one contention that just makes it so that they can spend all their time extending that one response, and now you've made a bad time trade-off because you tried responding to all 8 of their responses, but you missed one, and then they can just go for that one. Whereas now you may have had a less of an opportunity to respond to their case, whereas you can just strategically or just kick some of these contentions and collapse earlier in second rebuttal to then enable yourself to either flesh out your case more or get more content on the field that is actually collapsible. Because if you like, well, if your argument already has like 8 responses, well, the chances you're going to be able to successfully go for it are probably a lot lower. And the last kind of thing here is like extensions. Yeah, so the we kind of already talked about the lay application of that. So you kind of do want to extend at least some core components of your narrative. And I guess I kind of add on to it on the lay for the tech. The main sort of consensus is that you don't need to like extend the argument from constructive into a second rebuttal. Although I know there are like a few specific judges that like kind of require you to extend your argument in second rebuttal for it to be considered in the scope of the round. And especially for those sorts of judges, who might have those preferences, I would especially consider and like recommend, collapsing a lot earlier, because if you had to extend and also frontline and then respond, well, then the time allocation gets even more skewed, and you definitely don't have time to like extend 2 or more arguments. Okay, I think that's about it. If anyone has questions, feel free to ask now, and then if not, thank you for coming. Oh wait, Vidya, did I respond to your question? I just saw it, sorry. I don't know if I covered it. Okay, I'll respond to it now then. Um, yeah, so I think I already touched on the if I'm not if you're not on like able to respond to every point, which is when we were talking about like swirly arguments, like reading through the evidence, being able to identify like the unrealistic parts, and then also doing like comparative analysis and stuff like that. Um, for the part where you asked about writing out your rebuttal or speaking exempt, um, I think that like it really is a stylistic I guess a question. For me, I prefer like kind of on the tech level at least writing out most of what I'm gonna say, like most if not all, like even like typing some of these analytics just so that I can like be more efficient and kind of get a sense of like everything I'm reading. First, like to check how long my rebuttal is, so I'm making sure that like I always have time to get through everything, but then also um just being able to like be as efficient as possible so that I can condense what I'm saying in as few words as possible, and I don't have to like force myself to like think of the response when I'm going really fast and spreading these responses off the top of my head. Now, if you're able to do that and you have a preference for being able to think like very quickly and just be able to articulate stuff without seeing it on your screen, then obviously like go for that. I think on the lay, because you want to also like keep your speed in check, one good note is that you could like choose to write some of these responses on your rebuttal, in your rebuttal, like on your paper flow, or like if you're flowing on paper, and that way that you're not like writing out the entire response. So you also have to think through it. You have to sort of slow down and explain it thoroughly so that you also get it, and then also that you're I guess like thinking about what you're articulating or what you're saying instead of just like reading off a doc, which also might make you faster. So like that's like one consideration, I guess, on the lay. Um, but yeah, it really depends on what works best for you. Like good debaters, there are a plethora that do either. Um, okay, how and when would you read framing in case like second constructive? Yes. So framing can be read in first constructive, second constructive, or first rebuttal, really. Um, Usually if your case itself is like structured to be a structural violence um like sort of argument, and like all arguments you're making are like um I guess like impacted out, or like it's pretty obvious that your strategy is SV, then like it would be like you would introduce that framework inside of case, right? It would also give both teams a little bit more time to interact with them. Um, Now, if the second constructive wants to read framing, either because their case is also structured in a way that would be strategic for them, or if they want to frame out their opponent's offense, then you can read it there as well, and the same reasons apply to like first rebuttal. Would it be pre-written, or is there any way you can change it up really quickly to make it interact with your opponent's impact? So for framing, so I think like okay, obviously if you're first constructive, you don't know what your opponent's impacts are, so you'll be reading pre-written framing, right? If you're second constructive, I would say that in like most of these frameworks kind of intuitively respond to your opponent's impacts because the reason you're reading it as a responsive issue, like if you're second constructive or if you're first rebuttal, is likely because, for example, your opponents have not read any extinction impacts. So then automatically, um, it has that implicit interaction because you're like, okay, only prioritize extinction impacts, and then well, they haven't read any, so then you only like under that framing consideration, you're like the only team that has like offense on their app, right? I guess like if you there is like more points of potential clash or contestation, then you can think of something on the spot, or also kind of like type something out beforehand as like a potential frontline or like response you could read. An example of this is like when you're reading SV or something, you could read an argument about how there should not be Lincolns or like arguments being made about how big stick impacts like spill over or trickle down to these like SV impacts that you're talking about. And that's like one way you can, I guess, like implement a layer of analysis that interacts with their impact specifically. But like I guess like yes, there is like you should change it up quickly if you see that an issue in the round is that your opponent's impact could link under your framework or be used to take out your framework. Like any sort of issues, like if there is something that is changing or potentially different about this one round, this one case your opponent's reading, that your framing is not written in a way to prepare for, then like you should like I guess like point that out, like kind of preemptively prepare for that debate, because it's like likely the way that's gonna go. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah, anything else?
I've heard about like hiding stuff in rebuttal. Like, can you go more into that? Like hiding, like I've heard hiding spikes in all in case, but like more in rebuttal.
Um, oh yeah, okay. I get like just what we talked about earlier, or like
Yeah, sure.
yeah, okay. The two things I kind of mentioned were one, like hiding warrants, where you like kind of read longer cards. Well, I guess it's just about like the quality of the blocks you're cutting. But if you kind of have like a bunch of different arguments that are being made in the same article, that's like in a way kind of hidden because your opponents are like maybe reading through the doc and they're like, okay, well, this is only one response. And they're gonna read the tagline or gonna read like the first few lines and like try and get a sense of what it's saying, and they might miss something, right? If you have like 4 or 5 warrants inside of a card, then there's a good chance that one of them goes unresponded to. So that's like kind of one way to keep everything like condensed and sort of hidden. The other thing we were talking about is like incorporating a lot of like implications of weighing. And because these are like analytical or like they're not on the doc, they're on your flow, or you're just not setting them out because there's not like evidence. Um, if teams are like, floating off the dock or they're not paying too much attention, they might drop an implication and drop a piece of weighing off of a turn or a response, and that's a good way to like kind of keep these things like a little more hidden. But then like obviously you would blow it. Like the other part of this is that well, you don't have to spend like too much time on it, right? You just like kind of claim and then warrant for it, and or like a short explanation of why of what the implication you're making, and then if it goes dropped, then that one sentence now becomes like a potentially like 20-30 seconds clap strategy that you go for based on this response. Um, is there anything specific about like the narrative parlay debate, or just like generally like what it means? Like, okay, yeah. So I guess in general, like when you're debating in front of a lay, the most important thing is that you want to be building a very coherent and strong story and like narrative throughout the round, right? There has to be like one overall like argument that they can really attach to your side. And at the end of the round, when they're like sitting down and writing out their ballot, they'll remember your argument for that reason. Because like you have spent the 40 like okay, spent like the 20 minutes of your overall speeches like really just building on extending this one big picture, or not even like big picture, but this one main argument that your side is advocating for, as like a whole. So it can encompass many different components, but the overall narrative and the overall story you're telling should like stay consistent. And that is like kind of what we purpose our speeches to do inside a lay debate. I guess like through the strategy of like being a very narrative heavy lay debater is using each speech to kind of add on to the narrative and also like re-extend it so that you're keeping a consistent sort of story throughout and not letting a lot of variation or a lot of confusion seep in, which tends to happen if you try to read you know, more quantity heavy or more technical responses because then it diverges from something that they're more familiar with and it also is potentially like not going to be considered because more a very like a good amount of lay judges will only think about the round as like these two main issues, like the pro versus the con, and then it's up to you to define what the pro story is, like what is the pro in this round, right? I guess like an example of this is like um, on like Taiwan, our like lay and neg case, the Taiwan topic was about like reducing arms from the U.S. to Taiwan, and our lay neg was like very um like empiric centric and like very narrative centric about like for like the past 40 years, you know, the US has been doing this and it's kept peace in the region. There has not been major war, stuff like that. And every sort of argument we built off that was an extension of that overall narrative of how, like, throughout history, we've done this approach and done this policy. And yet we've not really seen, I guess, like the major problems with it. Yeah, I don't remember too off the top of my head, but like, you can kind of see like how you can use this like one overarching point and then everything you kind of say should fall under it and be consistent with what like I guess you're defining your side as. Okay, if there's no other questions, yeah, thank you again for coming and I'll end the meeting now.